Thomas Jefferson once claimed, "A democracy cannot be both ignorant and free." The framers of the Constitution believed that if the new U.S. citizens failed to share information among themselves, they would be worse off than they had been as subjects of the British monarchy. The new American settlers wanted both democracy and openness, leaving tyranny behind. Using this experience to guide them, the Constitutional Fathers wrote into their new Constitution a Bill of Rights which contained the First Amendment. The Bill of Rights contains the first 10 amendments. The First Amendment consists of 45 words that guarantees 5 individual freedoms to all Americans: religion, speech, the press, to assemble, and to petition. The Supreme Court has routinely held that First Amendment freedoms may be limited so as to protect the rights of others or to protect the government. The First Amendment has endured for more than 200 years, which shows how important its role is in America. Only a few times has it been set aside due to sedition acts and wartime censorship. Sedition Act of 1798, signed by President John Adams, gave federal authorities the right to prosecute any individual suspected of plotting against the federal government. After World War II, censorship was the hot topic, and the target was communism.
Fear grips the country. Not only fear of communist infiltration, but fear of being suspected of communist leanings. It is a climate that makes possible the rise of Joseph McCarthy, first-term senator from Wisconsin.
Even if there are only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
What we call McCarthyism is really political slander, and it didn't begin with McCarthy. He did not invent it. There are lots of traditions in American history where people accuse another party of being treasonous.
Freedom of religion gives Americans the choice of which church, synagogue, temple, or mosque to attend. This freedom lets us pray as we choose. The framers of the Constitution were familiar with the English established church, an official church that received government support. The First Amendment prevents the establishment of state churches. First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause prohibits deliberate religious persecution and discrimination by the government. Freedom of speech prevents our government from passing laws that could keep us from expressing our beliefs and opinions. Citizens have a right to speak out about how our government works. Restrictions apply to speech that incites violence, libel, child pornography, fighting words, or insults likely to provoke a physical fight, threats, and hate speech. Freedom of the press applies to newspapers, books, and magazines. The news in print represents part of the press. The news on television is part of the press, as is what you hear on the radio. Freedom of the press means our government cannot control the way our news is reported. The press does not have to ask the government for permission to write about things that happen in our community, our state, or in our country. Freedom of assembly gives Americans the right to come together and join groups. We can associate and join a variety of social, civic, or political groups. These groups have a right also to convey their views on topics. People are free to spend money to speak, buying advertisements, or printing leaflets to express their views. People are free to use symbolic expressions such as wearing armbands, waving flags, or burning flags. Freedom to petition our government gives us the right to try to change our government and the laws that govern our country. Asking mayors, senators, and presidents to support changes we want. Citizens are free to lobby government officials or petition the courts by filing lawsuits. The Bill of Rights, which contains the First Amendment, is important because it contains the procedural and substantive guarantees of individual liberties and the limits of government control and intervention. Court cases supporting First Amendment. Wisconsin v. Yoder, 1972. Case involving freedom of religion. The court ruled that Amish youth could be exempt from a state law requiring school attendance for all 14 to 16-year-olds since a religion required living apart from the world and worldly influence. The state's interest in making sure students attend 2 or more years of school was not enough to outweigh individual right to free exercise of religion. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. Freedom of speech. The court ruled that black armbands worn in protest of the Vietnam War by public school students like Mary Beth Tinker were symbolic speech and protected by First Amendment's free speech provision. The famous quote from the court's decision, "It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." Edwards v. South Carolina, 1963. A civil rights movement case. South Carolina arrested 187 peaceful segregation protesters for creating a breach of peace. The Supreme Court overturned their conviction, holding that the only reason they had been arrested was the expression of an unpopular viewpoint, expression protected by the First Amendment. And here's something to think about. How would our lives be different if we didn't have the First Amendment?